the whole idea of shift left for security is we've moved it to like our most expensive employees, our engineers, which is great because they can make really good decisions if they have the right context. But if you've shifted left so far where there's no context as to like how this software runs, like if I'm going to upgrade a dependency, if I don't know when and how or where or if that software is even running, I can't really make a decision about whether to fix these vulnerabilities or not.
Welcome to a new episode of All Aboard, the show where we have real conversations with IT and security practitioners. No fluff, no talking points, just straight talk from experts and advice for tackling the toughest problems facing cloud-forward companies today. I'm your host, Alex Bovee, CEO and co-founder of Conductor One. For this week's episode, I'm thrilled to have Rob Szumski join us on the show. Rob is the CEO and co-founder of Edgebit, a software supply chain security system that helps teams cut through the noise and prioritize the most important software vulnerabilities in their apps. With over a decade of experience in the security space, Rob has seen the good, the bad, and the ugly of vulnerability management. In today's pod, he gives us a primer on SBOMs, that is software bill of materials, and talks through some of the challenges companies have using them. Rob also shares his thoughts on shifting left, the differences between centralized versus decentralized security, and at what stage companies should be thinking about compliance. Let's jump right in. Hey, Rob, thanks for joining me today. Appreciate you taking the time. We're going to talk about, presumably, a topic that's very close to Edgebit's heart, which is software bill of materials. And it's something, I'll just be honest with you, I do not know much about. So I was kind of thinking maybe just to start things off, can you just explain in very like layman's terms, talk to me like I'm 5 years old, what is an SBOM and why is that actually important to companies?
Yeah, so the greater kind of area is software supply chain security. This is like, just like we have a physical supply chain, like is the steel I'm using in my submarine going to hold up to the depths? The same thing for the software. This open source dependency, this closed source dependency, where did I get these from? Have they been modified? That kind of thing. And so an SBOM is just the inventory that holds the metadata that says these are the 900 libraries that make up this piece of software. This is where they came from. This is what they're called. Now, typically you see that paired with a few other pieces of metadata. Like once you understand what's in it, you probably want to know, are there any security issues with these? And so you pair some vulnerability data in there. And then after that, it's like, oh, do these vulnerabilities actually affect me or affect this piece of software when it's deployed? And so you've got like, how exploitable are these? And so like those three things are basically your all the metadata you need to make that decision.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I guess it's been interesting to see I feel like over the last year and a half, software supply chain, SBOMs, it feels like it's fever pitch at like a security narrative level. Like, every time I'm on LinkedIn, I'm just seeing what people are talking about. It's definitely a hot area. Can you, why is that? Like, why now? Why has it become such a fever pitch issue today?
Yeah, probably three main things. One, like there's real attacks happening here. And so like SolarWinds and kind of these big ones, but also a bunch of smaller ones. And then you've got more folks because of those just poking around in this area. And so there's more researchers kind of shedding light on stuff. And so that is making it a little bit hotter. But then lastly, the federal government is, putting their foot down and saying, we need to get serious about this problem. And so the Biden administration put out a cybersecurity directive a few years ago now, but it's trickling down through all the government agencies. And so Office of Management and Budget has an opinion now. It's making its way into NIST guidelines. I think it's only a matter of time before it comes down into SOC 2 and ISO compliance, like the commercial regime. And so that's kind of building and probably the groundswell for all of this.
Yeah. The federal government is obviously a huge procurer of software in general. So yeah, whatever they say probably goes at some level. And then if it makes its way into a compliance regimen, then yeah, pretty much everyone's going to have to do something there. Can you talk a little bit more about, I guess, like very tactically, what does an SBOM look like, and or how does that data get transmitted across like organizational boundaries? Is that a digital artifact, a manifest of some kind? Is it cryptographically signed? Is there a standard around it? Is there a protocol around it? And at whatever depth makes sense to kind of talk about that. I'm actually just kind of curious on those like a little bit more technical details.
Yeah, so there's two kind of competing standards here, Cyclone DX and SPDX. They're just list of inventories of dependencies at the end of the day. You do typically sign these. And so you would say version XYZ of my software, here's the SBOM for it. We've signed it just like we would sign that release artifact of the actual binary so that you can trust it. And when you're selling to the federal government, you transmit this to them, and they either use it as like kind of an archive and audit purpose, or probably what they're actually going to do is go scan that and see what they think the vulnerabilities inside of there are and what their risk threshold is. And so those other artifacts I was talking about are useful to send along with them to say like, hey, we've already kind of automatically remediated a lot of these, and here's the proof of that. And so all of that can be transmitted digitally as well.
Yeah, yeah. You mentioned a little bit how the federal government is, top down, really, I think, shining a light, it sounds like, on the software supply chain and starting to push maybe even like into the standards regime. One thing that I think is interesting from a standard standpoint is the second you make something a standard, part of a compliance regimen, particularly with like SOC 2, it just means everybody's got to go do it, right? It becomes like a cost of doing business, and really doesn't even matter to some degree like how small of a company you are. It becomes like a best practice. What's your thoughts on, just in the current state of the world today, sort of practical tips for security and IT teams? What's the right size of company, and or what's the size and shape of either organizationally what you look like, or the kind of software you're selling, where you should really be looking into either analyzing SBOMs from your vendor partners if you're including things in your software, and or look at getting serious at providing that to your customers?
Definitely if you sell to the government, but really if you're just producing software, you need to start getting your hands on these types of things because folks are going to start demanding it. And so, yeah, that looks like typically, especially if you pull in a lot of open source, they're probably producing SBOMs upstream for some of those things. And so it really does start to become like an aggregation exercise, which is tough in its own right. And then at the same time, you should be doing vulnerability management. Like you should have a program and SLAs, like especially if you're under SOC 2 or ISO, you're definitely doing that, FedRAMP, et cetera. And so using an SBOM to help supercharge those platforms kind of kills two birds with one stone. And so it really does look like any software vendor basically needs to get their hands on these things.
You're telling me it's like a best practice to know what's in the food. It's like,
right, exactly.
In some ways, it feels a little bit like this is like the FDA mandated like nutrition labels, where you got to tell the ingredients to the person buying the food. Like, it makes a lot of sense, even if you're selling something small.
Yeah. Well, my analogy, it's kind of like the early days of SaaS where there were no status pages. Like you just it was hearsay whether like something was down or not. And it's the same thing for folks that have they fixed this new bug of the week that came out. Without these like SBOMs and some of this metadata, you just don't know, right? And it's like, well, should I stop using that service? Like, what's going on with LastPass? Should I be putting my passwords there anymore? And like, you just don't really know. And so it's kind of like we're getting out of the Wild West days and getting into like something that's like both human and machine readable. The other interesting thing is like, if you go talk to folks, like Log4j was really hard for just folks to even understand, like, do we use this? And like, yes, somewhere, but like which teams? Is it on live machines right now? Like, where are those? Just a really hard problem to solve. And you just need software and automation to do it.
This actually feels, well, internally we talk a lot about this. There's this trend that I see happen in security and IT right now, and particularly the convergence of the two around the decentralization of a lot of the old sort of like command and control structures, if you will. And we talk about the goodness that's there, particularly around our company. We're an identity and access control solution, decentralizing, pushing access control decisions to people that have the best information to make the decision makes a lot of sense. This actually, in some ways, that there's the double-edged sword to that, right? And it sounds like the potentially negative side of like the decentralization. You got teams off running, building software, procuring software and middleware, and using open source projects to make themselves successful. Is that it can create a little bit of like a Wild West around the supply chain potentially, and what is in all those different software modules. That's really, I think that's actually really interesting. It's like we talk about the good parts sometimes of these trends and movements, but sometimes there's a little bit of downside that you got to address as well.
Yeah, I think this is like, that whole idea of shift left for security is we've moved it to like our most expensive employees, our engineers, which is great because they can make really good decisions if they have the right context. But if you've shifted left so far where there's no context as to like how this software runs, like if I'm going to upgrade a dependency, if I don't know when and how or where or if that software is even running, I can't really make a decision about whether to fix these vulnerabilities or not. And so what we want to do is give the context to those engineers in their world. So in a pipeline, in GitHub, when they're making a code change. And so it's the same thing that you're trying to do with your product is, yes, we do want to decentralize that, but also like a central security team needs to have understanding across all the teams, across all the apps, what's going on. And, you know, the old world used to be sling a bunch of tickets over to every single team, just saying like, go investigate this, go investigate that, and then report back. Like, obviously nobody wants to be doing that. And so giving the engineers the control is a win if they have the context to do it correctly.
Yeah, it's great. It just goes to show it's so interesting. These like patterns are the same, right? It's like you can move to decentralization, but by moving to decentralization, you need central policy enforcement, and you need to push the context to the decision makers as well. It's like universal across, you know, every sort of like problem that you can imagine. Can you, you know, one problem that it seems like I would imagine developers probably face as it relates to, you know, SBOMs and just securing the supply chain software in general is you run npm install, you get, you know, 1,000 things, right? Like that's a sprawl. It probably, I gotta imagine it's like hard to actually make sense of even what's included sometimes in your software. What is your software even using? How do you guys think about that? Do you see companies actually struggling with that problem?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, just a standard like Node.js application already has 900 things in it. And then it's like, now you've got 2 JavaScript teams. Did they even make the same decisions around the same dependencies? Like, probably not. They're using different versions, etc. And so I think, again, it's like giving folks context as to what are other teams doing in this space without, you know, you having to go just ask every single team is really important. And then you got to understand, like, what's the health of these things from like an open source perspective? Like, do they have active maintainers? Are they signing their release artifacts? Like that type of open source intelligence. But the most critical, we think, is understanding how your actual company is using it. Your Linux servers out in the cloud, you know, is this thing actually even used? It could be that it's packaged up for some use case that you don't use. It's using a plugin that you don't use. That's really great knowledge to have. So if there's a vulnerability in that and it's just dormant code, yes, you should fix it, but like it should be lower on the priority list than something that's actually active and hot and has this critical vulnerability.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. How are companies solving these problems today? Because I have to imagine understanding your software supply chain is something everyone's going to do at some level. You know, if you have a basic level of security, and it sounds like clearly, you know, Edgebit focuses on the automation tools around that and making that better. I know this space is like kind of evolving around having, you know, other companies doing a lot from an automation standpoint. But what is that automation typically replacing? Like, how do people manage this today?
I mean, much like in your world, like probably the most manual effort is like an Excel spreadsheet that just says like what libraries they're using and what versions. And, you know, the millisecond you hit save, it's out of date. You know, I think that's also universal across all areas of tech. But then folks are doing things, a little bit of automation in the build pipeline. There might be really good tooling that they use for Go, but they're a polyglot organization and they have no coverage on their JavaScript, or, you know, vice versa. You can imagine how this works. And so I think that is going to be the biggest win for folks, is finding a set of tools that work across all the teams that they're using. And then not having those tools live in like a silo where they're just shifted so far left that they have no context. That like kind of connecting back to production, we think, is really key.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. Can you talk? I want to shift back focus for one more second to what you'd mentioned earlier around like some of the use cases around supply chain, and clearly like looking at the software bill of materials and sort of understanding what potential vulnerabilities might exist, and then going and addressing those is like one use case. What are the main use cases that are associated with kind of, from a security standpoint, supply chain security, and do companies like, do you need to address all of those threats at once, or is there a prioritization around there? Is it about like vulnerability management first? You know, can you talk just a little bit more about like the security implications, I guess, of the supply chain management part?
Yeah, there's a bunch of different pieces and you don't have to tackle them all at once. So vulnerability management is kind of one side of it, whether that's for security or compliance. There's also like kind of end-to-end verification of artifacts. Like the thing that you deployed, did it actually come from your build system or the open source library that you went and fetched? Was it not modified in transit, and did it come from where we thought it did? There's kind of that side of it. And then there's enforcing policy around, all right, well, you're only allowed to go get things from over here or over there, or you're allowed to do that in dev but not in prod, and that kind of side of it as well. And you don't have to solve all these at once. If your threat model doesn't kind of include malicious actors like modifying dependencies as you're installing them, then maybe you care more about vuln management, or your applications aren't sitting on the internet, and so you have a different stance, that type of thing. But realistically, everybody should be doing at least a little bit of all of those things, if not, progressing all the way to expert level on all of them.
Yeah. Any thoughts, just to double click on that for a second, like, putting myself in the shoes of, let's say, 100-person startup. You got maybe one, maybe two people kind of full-time thinking about security across InfoSec. Maybe that's a shared responsibility with IT. Maybe the CTO picks up a lot of that. How do people get started in that scenario? Like, where should they go? Are there tools that you tell them to reach for? Is it just about kind of that basic level of hygiene of like, step one, tie your shoes, just create, for better or worse, the spreadsheet and kind of understanding where their software comes from? But do you have like practical sort of tips and just even getting started, like where people should start?
Yeah, there's a bunch of great open source tools. I would say skip the spreadsheet and just progress to some sort of automation.
Okay.
But inside of you probably already have some sort of build pipeline. Start layering in some of the tools, like build an SBOM and just start saving that to a cloud storage bucket or something, and just having that, getting used to it. Ideally, start actually doing vuln management on that. And, there's a bunch of great tools, especially for open source, like GitHub's Dependabot is really great. It's probably already in, the workflow that you're already using. So just do something. Start understanding your dependencies and being smart about how you're selecting them, and then you can kind of ratchet it up over time.
Yeah. Gotcha. That's the crawl, is basically get something in your build pipeline at some basic automation level and know what's in your software. Step one.
Right. Yes.
Know
what's in, remove things that shouldn't be there.
Know what's in the sausage. Yeah. And then remove things that shouldn't be there. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. What, any hot takes or predictions for supply chain security in 2023?
I don't think I have any hot takes. I think it's just going to I truly believe that once this comes down into the commercial compliance side of things, it's just going to affect every single software company. And so anytime that you're seeing headlines about federal this or government that, just replace that with the compliance that you're already doing today. It's going to be coming down. And a lot of folks are already following NIST guidelines, maybe not 100%, but they follow a lot of them. This stuff is already in there. And so it's going to be forced down on you at some point, so you might as well get started now.
Yeah. Okay, great. So it's already in NIST. I mean, that makes it 100%. I agree with that prediction because I've seen that play out in the multi-factor authentication market, whatever it was 10 years ago or something like that, where NIST is it's the wind before the storm, if you know what I mean. It's just it's pretty much guaranteed to start happening and making its way into the commercial compliance frameworks at that point, and also regional and government frameworks too. I remember NYDFS was a big driver of multi-factor authentication early days and things like that.
And I'll throw NIST and some of these other orgs a kudos because they're not being extremely prescriptive. Like I talked about, there's kind of these two competing standards for SBOMs. Nowhere does it say use one of those. They're being pretty fuzzy by design, and I think it's the correct level of fuzziness. I think it's crisping up as it gets to each successive organization. And so DHS or Department of Veterans Affairs or somebody are going to make their own decisions about prescriptively, here's what you should do. But NIST isn't doing that, which I think is very smart. They're saying, here are the best practices, implement them how you see fit, use tools, use whatever you think matches.
Yeah.
And so I just think they're doing a great job about it. It does make it a little bit of a slower process that I would like to see move faster, just because I want people to get to better security faster. But it's probably overall the right move to make.
Yeah. I mean, to spend one more minute on that for a second are you seeing commercially between private organizations, companies using NIST guidelines to kind of talk to their vendors and partners about what they're doing from a supply chain standpoint? So those conversations you're seeing happening in industry already.
Yeah. And, again, it's folks that are trying to just make smart decisions about the software that they've received, especially when they run it themselves, but they're not experts in it. Just like any security team at a large bank, they can't know every single application. And so they just want to have the most context. And so they're starting to ask, I need an SBOM because we have some tools that will parse and we'll come up with our own risk score for what this is, for how we use it. And so I think that's just going to continue to increase and increase.
Yeah, awesome. Well, Rob, thanks for taking the time today and joining me to talk about securing software supply chain and SBOMs, and wish you guys the best of luck at Edgebit. And thanks for coming on.
Yeah, it's been great. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in. This episode of All Aboard is brought to you by the team at Conductor One. We'd love to hear your feedback. Send us a message at allaboard@conductorone.com. Till next time.